Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am your host for today's event. Today's event will be a live book signing and book discussion event. And we are going to talk about a fantastic, voluminous new biography of General Philip Kearny. General Philip Kearny, A Very God of War, by William B. Stipel. And I am going to introduce you to Bill Stipel. William B. Stipel. Bill Stipel?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bill Stipel is with us. Bill is the author or editor of nearly 24 books and documentaries about the Civil War. Bill has been thinking about the Civil War for a long time, and he's been writing about it. He's been editing books about it. There's so much valuable stuff that he's produced. But just briefly, his 1998 book, The Little Bugler, won the Young Readers Award from the Civil War Roundtable of New York. Other titles of his include McClellan's Other Story, Tell Me of Lincoln, which we have a copy of right there. We're not going to talk too much about these, but I'm just going to show you that we do have them. It's easy. Tell Me of Lincoln, Generals in Bronze. Here's Generals in Bronze. We have a copy of that. I like this one. Those interviews were really fun. And then Writing and Fighting, the Civil War. There are these other writing and fightings too, right? Writing and Fighting the Confederate War.
Yes.
Writing and Fighting the Army of Northern Virginia. Andersonville, Giving Up the Coast. In other words, Bill, you've had the Civil War on your mind for a long time, but you also tell us even before that, let's get into our book. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture I have right here on our, I've made a little PowerPoint slide for you. Here is our book for today. It is General Philip Kearny, A Very God of War, The Life and Letters of General Philip Kearny, published by Belgrove Publishing in New Jersey this year. This is a first edition that you're buying today. 813 pages, has illustrations and maps. We are selling it for $67, and you can order it at the link. And that brings us to Bill Stipel. Bill, I really enjoyed the introduction to this book, because tell us about why you have been thinking about Phil Kearny for a long time.
I grew up born and raised in Kearney, New Jersey. And
Okay.
it was the town that was named after him. He had lived there before the Civil War, killed in the war. And after 1867, they wanted to name it after the most famous resident. It was also the place where the state of New Jersey built the first disabled soldiers' home. The soldiers were coming back from the war minus limbs, and these men were going to need care for the rest of their lives. So the state of New Jersey built a facility located in Kearney, New Jersey. Over 22,000 Union veterans spent their final years at the home. So for me, growing up in the town of Kearney, everyone knew a Civil War soldier. Everyone knew a veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg. And those stories were passed down to me. And in my grammar school classroom, I'm in second grade, third grade, and on the wall, we have George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Phil Kearny. And to me, looking up at those three heroes, they were the same. So my interest in Phil Kearny started in grammar school, and I would collect information and articles and letters and read the biographies that were written about him. Difficult reads, but I was able to build upon my collection. And it was really this book, my book, is the result of 50 years of research. No exaggeration.
Well, I've noticed something even before this book, Bill. I've noticed something that people that are interested in Phil Kearny tend to be very interested in Phil Kearny. Now, if you look behind me, you can get a biography of Ben Butler. You read it. Okay, that was good. A biography of Salmon Chase. But everybody I know that's into Phil Kearny, he is just fascinating. And it's like you go down that rabbit hole of research, and you have to, you're not the only person I've met. No, you are the most committed researcher of Phil Kearny I've ever met. But am I right?
Absolutely.
Fellow travelers, is it like that? Is he?
He was a battle soldier. He was a come on, boys, follow me type general, and not a go on ahead, lads. He led the charge. And the common soldier worshiped him for that. He shared their dangers. And so the quotes are in the book. If you ask Ulysses Grant or Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or James Longstreet who the greatest soldier they knew, okay, they all said Philip Kearny.
Okay.
And I have a letter in the book I use from Helen Longstreet, the widow of General James Longstreet. And she was asked, what was the single most event from the Civil War that affected her husband? And she said the death of his best friend, Phil Kearny. It pained his heart until it ceased to beat. He never got over the thought that he was responsible for the death of his best friend, Kearny. So Kearny was a general or a soldier that was respected by both North and South.
And he was, and again, I'm going to stick to this idea of, I want people who are watching this, because not the people that are watching this, Bill, are maybe learning about Phil Kearny for the first time right now. And I think, in my opinion, you may agree or disagree, but in my opinion, one of the things I would want people to understand in 2022 is how famous, how well known Phil Kearny was in his day. They knew that.
Yes.
People knew that this was Kearny the Magnificent. That wasn't made up after he died. That was him in life.
When he was a first lieutenant, he was selected to go to the French cavalry school at Saumur in France to study French tactics and come back to the United States and write the very first cavalry manual. Our mounted arm was in its infancy in 1840. And there wasn't even a manual to maneuver the troops. And so Kearny's assignment was to go to France. So he was envied by a lot of officers for having that coveted duty. And then serving with the French in Algeria, seeing war for the first time, and being then selected on the staff of Commander Winfield Scott in the Mexican War. Other famous members of that staff was, again, Robert E. Lee and Beauregard and others. But Kearny was famed for his famous charge at Churubusco in August of 1847, in which he lost an arm. Poetry was written about that event and sung in the barracks. He was a genuine, respected soldier by all that knew him. And this is decades before the Civil War.
Right. Okay, well then let's go back to the beginning. What's the source of this romanticism? What's the source of this fame that he family wealth, I know, is part of it.
Yes.
But tell us about that, the early inspiration for Kearny to go into a soldier's life.
He was born a soldier. Let's say it was since infancy. His father said he wanted to be a soldier, and it was partly because he did have some relatives that had served in the War of 1812. His uncle Stephen Watts Kearny became a famous soldier in his own right, and George Watts, who served on the staff of a young Winfield Scott. And it also said it was tales that his mother had read him of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. He was a chivalrous man. And I have one of his earliest, he was about 14 or 15 years old, and he had to write an essay for school, and it was entitled Dulce et decorum est propter mori, the Latin phrase by Horace, it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. That was his motto since he was 12. And he wanted to go to West Point, but his father and grandfather would not allow it. His father was wealthy, and so it's the same as grandfather. Father was founder of the New York Stock Exchange.
Okay.
And so they had a very privileged upbringing, and they would not allow him to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He had to go to Columbia College in Manhattan and become a lawyer. And out of obedience, love of his father and grandfather, he obeyed their wishes. But when his grandfather passed, Philip Kearny inherited over $1 million. And this is $1837, okay? It was a vast fortune. But what it did was he was now set free. As I say in the book, the tethered eagle was now set free. He had all the money he could ever spend, and he was free to do what he did. He did. He joined the army. So I tell folks out there, if you're going to hit the mega millions for $300 million tomorrow, are you going to join the army the next day? And they shake their heads. But Philip Kearny did join the army right after he inherited $1 million from his grandfather.
Yeah. So it was truly his dream. He had this romantic, I think romantic's the word I want to choose. Quixotic wouldn't seem to define it, but a romantic dream he saw himself as a soldier. Let's take a look at an image you have in the book here, and it's one of my favorites. I'm glad you included it. It's a high definition image. Thank you for having these really high quality images in it. But to me, this is a picture of a soldier. That's a picture of a general right there.
It was taken in early 1862. The photographer was R.W. Addis on Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. Kearny is wearing his brigadier general's uniform. He hadn't received his second star yet. But it also shows his trademark imperial, which he had raised after Napoleon III. It was in the 1850s in France and Paris. It seemed every gentleman grew an imperial, and it sort of became his trademark.
Yeah, and yeah, to get everybody up to speed, by the time this picture is taken in 1861, of course, he's been in the war with Mexico. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But what I guess what I hadn't planned on talking about, which is just so when you bring it up here with the he's sort of adopting the Napoleonic look, is that this guy has already been in the Battle of Solferino. He's fought with the French. He's fought in Algeria. So he's not only been a U.S. soldier, he's had this soldier of fortune experience by this time.
I don't use soldier of fortune.
Okay.
He was a soldier with a fortune. A soldier of fortune is in the army for pay, for booty or working, for another government. But Kearny was always he was sent by the U.S. government to observe French tactics. That's why he was in Africa, and also then fighting in Italy at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. He was a volunteer aide, serving without pay for the commander of the Imperial Guard Cavalry, General Maurice. And so Kearny never sought fortune, but he loved mortal combat.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid of being killed or being severely wounded. The loss of an arm did not stop him. And he believed in fate. He believed when his time was up, it was going to be up. And until then, again, they say he loved the music of the shells and whistles going by his head. Okay.
Yeah. So as you said, he's born to be a soldier. He happened to have a fortune, but born to be a soldier, huh?
Yes.
And it seems to have been something that people knew and understood at the time. Yeah.
Well, the commanders of the Civil War, both North and South, the Battle of the Age was the Battle of Solferino in Italy, 1959. And that battle was studied by them. And some say Lee had that battle on his mind when he was fighting the Battle of Gettysburg. But anyway, so at the outbreak of the Civil War, Kearny was quite possibly, and I go out as far as to say this, he was the most experienced combat soldier in the United States, North or South, with the exception of Winfield Scott. Mm-hmm. Scott had served in the war well, and we know his history. But, at the time, 46-year-old Phil Kearny saw more battle than any other general, North or South.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, but there's a lot new in this book, folks, because there have been other Kearny biographies. This one is not like those. This is a voluminous biography, and a lot of what Bill is giving us is new. And right now, Bill, one of the things that some of these biographers didn't care to talk about was, even though it's called a personal history, we'll look at that DePaster in a minute, but there's not that much personal in these books, and the guy had a fascinating personal life. So what are some of the romantic stuff that's going on?
It was a life filled with scandal, and his two biographers were relatives. His cousin John Watts DePaster wrote the first biography of Phil Kearny, published in 1869. And his grandson, Thomas Kearny, wrote the second biography, published in 1937. Mm-hmm. And they both
of those right. I'll show them off while you're talking about them.
Well, right. Right. In 1869, you did not write tell-all. Okay. Mm-hmm. And especially the scandalous aspects of Phil Kearny's life was not mentioned.
Right.
Where Thomas Kearny does mention.
General Philip.
That's the 1937. So he's Thomas Kearny does. Right? He does mention it, but he doesn't go in depth, and he really was ignorant of the facts, because Philip Kearny was divorced from his first wife, and it was an incredible scandal that rocked not just the United States, but the Army. Okay, and a lot of the wives of his fellow officers wouldn't allow their husbands to socialize with Philip Kearny, and more due to this scandalous divorce. This romance was reported in every newspaper in the United States, from New York to California, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Mm-hmm. Every newspaper reported on this scandal. It was the biggest scandal in the 1850s until Dan Sickles killed Philip Barton Kay. Mm-hmm. In Washington, but in the meanwhile, it ruined Kearny's reputation socially, and a divorce happened. And divorces were sealed in New York State for 100 years. Okay, so no one knew the facts of the case until I untied that piece of red tape and read the divorce accounts, and I was shocked by them. And, some might criticize me for putting it in the book, but I believe in showing a person, a historical figure, warts and all. And I included it.
Well, I'm glad you included it, because I think even the folks that are watching us right now would notice that here we are. I'm a bookseller. You're a serious biographer and historian that want to tell the warts and all history, but we've spent 20 minutes just sort of framing the legendary guy. And here we are, coming up on the halfway point of our interview. And this is the first time we're kind of getting to that scandal and the divorce and the personal life. And it's all very important. And it is going to be important for people to understand the soldier as well.
What it did, it kept him from getting command in 1861. He approached the governor of New York and offered his services. It was refused, was just ignored. Mm-hmm. And no state would give him a command. And it was a friend of his, a neighbor, that approached Abraham Lincoln. And this was immediately after the Battle of Furt's Bull Run. The Union Army had just been routed. And there was talk of just incompetent commanders. And this friend of Kearny told Lincoln that he must make Kearny a brigadier general. And Lincoln listened to him. And I did find a letter that was written to Lincoln. It's buried in the National Archives. And he urges Lincoln to make Kearny a brigadier general, and just don't worry about that scandalous love affair and the so on that all happened. But that's what kept Kearny from getting early command. And it was Lincoln realized Kearny was a fighter, and war means killing, and that's why he made Kearny. And Lincoln referred to Kearny as my brigadier.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But so you've already, before we started, we had a little chat. We were chatting about the scandal, and you were saying that there are some audiences that you talk to a lot that don't want to hear about the war. Just tell us more about the.
It's that.
So I would tell us without giving away the book, because they're going to want to buy the book and read it. What went wrong here with Phil and Diana?
Phil and Diana, had a young family.
The first Philip and Diana.
The first, so the family. He had his first wife. They had 4 children, but they were so much alike that they could not live together. Mm-hmm. And while he was off fighting in the Mexican War and serving in Western outposts, the marriage fell apart. She left him. So she left him, and they lived apart for several years. But while in Paris, Philip Kearny met and fell in love with a young lady, was the daughter of a New York political figure, and it was a true romance. And Phil Kearny wanted to divorce Diana, approached her about a divorce. But back then, you just didn't get divorced. Separation was all right, it was agreed upon, but no one got divorced. So it was a bad breakup and a bad divorce. And so Diana, you'll see, had a family portrait and had her husband removed from the picture. You see Philip Kearny's hand there, holding the hand of his young son, John Watts Kearny.
The dad is supposed to be up here.
Yeah, and so I guess it's the 1850s version of unfriending someone, but it's
canceling him.
Yeah,
where did you find this? I hadn't seen this published before.
No, it became from Diana's carte de visite album. Her family photographs. She wanted to keep the pictures of her children, right? But she got rid of Philip.
Yeah, got rid of the husband.
Yes.
That is such an interesting story. But I think it demonstrates that his personal life has a lot of effect on the war and on the public events of his life. It
haunted him, but he didn't write about it. He didn't talk about it. I can find no references of him actually discussing past scandals. He did, marry again after the divorce to his second wife, Agnes, and they were truly in love. They were inseparable, but Agnes understood that Phil Kearny felt that his country was in peril. Even though living in Paris in 1861, January, having millions of dollars and the lifestyle of a Parisian gentleman, respected by French officers, and when his nation became in peril with the firing of Fort Sumter, he rushed home to the United States and offered his services to his country. Agnes understood that and supported that, even though they also now had 3 young children, a young family. And it's hard to explain, and I do talk about it in the book, but he loved his country more than his own life.
Mm-hmm. Where did they live when the family came back from Paris?
In Belgrove, the chateau that he had built in New Jersey along the banks of the Passaic River was like a 100-acre estate. And it's where he also housed his art collection. He was a friend and patron to all the American artists living in Rome and in Paris. and also the Hudson River School. He purchased their paintings and their sculpture, and filled his mansion with their art. And so,
did he build it?
He built it. The architecture was T. Thomas and Sons in Manhattan. They were considered like the fashionable architects of the day, and it spared no expense. It was the most modern building at the time. It had modern plumbing for 1858, and he had an estate in which he raised cattle and sheep, and by all accounts, it was the most beautiful home in the area. But he lived there very, very little.
Right. Because he went right off to war. They had just come back.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to take a brief break here, Bill, because I want to shout out to some of the people that are watching. Been so kind as to say hello. Some of them are regulars. And so we have David watching from Gurnee, Illinois. Welcome back, David. Good to see you. And Dan is watching from Denver. And Fernando is watching from Venezuela. Hello, Fernando. Thank you very much for joining us to talk about the U.S. Civil War. And if anybody has any questions about Phil Kearny or any questions for Bill Stipel, go ahead and ask them there in the comments of the Facebook of this live stream. I'll check the live stream again before we're out of time here. But feel free to ask the questions. I don't mind if you ask the questions, and I know that Bill loves to answer any question you might have about this person that he spent his life researching. Now, Bill, let's go ahead and get Phil Kearny to this U.S.-Mexico war, because you've talked a little bit about it before, but that is certainly where he and in that arm part ways. And that gets us to, like this heroic charge at the Battle of Churubusco?
Churubusco,
Yep.
in August 1847. Part of the advance of Scott's army to Mexico City.
Mm-hmm. And so there's this heroic cavalry charge by the 1st Dragoons.
Yeah, Philip Kearny was a captain then, commanding Company F of the 1st U.S. Dragoons. And more or less when the battle was over and the Mexicans were retreating into Mexico City, he asked permission to launch his dragoons and follow up the route. And as they approached, you'll see in the illustration, Kearny is to the right on the white horse, approaching a battery of Mexican guns, who then, literally fired a volley of canister round. Kearny was hit in the left elbow, shattered his arm. The amputation took place later that evening. But Kearny always felt that had his charge been supported, the army could have captured Mexico City that day. Instead, General Scott offered an armistice, and the taking of Mexico City took place the following month in September 1847.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good illustration.
By Walker.
It also shows the city of Mexico is there in the background, and that the
artist Walker was famous for his paintings of that campaign, and this is his only one that depicts Phil Kearny's action.
Right. Let's go ahead and get back to here. So now that we get him, now that he's a general in George McClellan's army, he's immediately associated. I could be wrong about that, but he's associated with New Jersey troops.
Yes,
right? He has a famous brigade, right?
Yes. So the friend of Kearny that got him the commission from Lincoln, his name is Cortlandt Parker, and New Jersey was creating their first brigade of volunteers. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Jersey Infantry formed the New Jersey Brigade. Afterwards, the 4th New Jersey was added to it in September '61. But they needed a brigade commander, and Brigadier General Phil Kearny took command of it and took these. These were volunteers. These were shop workers, students, teachers, just inexperienced men, and Kearny turned them into soldiers. And they were considered at the winter of 61, 62 to be the finest brigade in the Army of the Potomac. It was recognized by everyone. They acted like regular Army troops.
Mhm.
And so these men of the 1st New Jersey Brigade considered Kearny their military father, and they never forgot him. And they took care of his memory. And right up until when there were only 2 or 3, or a half dozen of them left alive, they would still gather and meet and lay a wreath at a statue of Phil Kearny. And so they were his true champions the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and they did become I guess, an elite brigade in McClellan's army.
Which they were mishandled in a few battles and were decimated. And Kearny had been promoted, assigned to a division command in May now of 62. He had to leave the New Jersey Brigade and take command of a division that was under fire during the siege of Yorktown. And so being ordered to take, you can't refuse an order to take command of troops under fire. Mm-hmm. So Kearny was reluctant to leave his Jersey boys, but had to take command of the division. And the 1st New Jersey Brigade was roughly handled at Gaines's Mill and later at Second Manassas. And Kearny felt bad about that. It bothered him.
Yeah, they were not directly they weren't in his division after he got the division. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So Kearny took command of the 3rd Division, 3rd Corps, under General Heintzelman, commanded the Corps. And Heintzelman was lukewarm to exhibiting authority over Kearny. And Heintzelman wrote in his diary, Kearny takes command of the 3rd Division. I fear he'll be troublesome. And he was.
Well, now we're going to get let's get to some of these Civil War stories because in his short Civil War career, it was certainly packed with action.
For your watchers and listeners and students of history, the one character that I'd liken Phil Kearny to is George S. Patton. Okay. Kearny was an attack, no retreat, meet the enemy, fight the enemy, defeat the enemy, and move on. Kearny's military or motto, whatever we would say, was well-directed war never lags. Okay. And so Kearny really didn't see eye to eye to General McClellan, who McClellan lags. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't see eye to eye, but McClellan could never spare a fighter and kept Kearny and accepted his somewhat insubordination. But it was famous throughout the Army that Kearny denounced McClellan as a coward or a traitor for not following up the victory at Malvern Hill and ordering his army to retreat to Harrison's Landing. That was, that hurt Kearny quite a bit.
That's pretty sharp. I mean, a public statement against the commanding general.
He made it many times to many people. And Kearny didn't care. He realized that the war could very well have been won after Malvern Hill. His army was thoroughly beaten. Kearny had spent that day of the battle collecting troops that were separated from their commands. He had assembled about 5,000 men and had them officered, picked up here and there. And he approached McClellan and asked permission to lead this command and attack the retreating Confederates. And McClellan refused, and that was like the last straw for Phil Kearny.
Yeah, but there's something else, and I don't want the folks at home to think that I'm too obsessed with the popular culture of Phil Kearny, but I kind of am, because there are a lot of good generals, but everybody watches what Phil Kearny does. And so that means you as a biographer and us as students of the war get some really great art, and like the illustration by Walker. And then here is very first battle. Everybody has a first battle, but Kearney captures the attention of Alfred Woad.
Yes.
And there he is, painted in watercolor wash.
Yes.
By one of the leading artists, the combat artists of the war. Kearney's attack at the Battle of Williamsburg.
May 5th, 1862, Kearney led numerous assaults that day. Okay. Each, as his division arrived on the field, one regiment at a time, he would lead that regiment into action. And I guess it caught Wood's eye. And he made a hastily, and really it's a beautiful watercolor wash of Kearney leading the charge, his cape flowing in the background, holding his saber in his one arm, and usually it would be the reins in his teeth. And the men would follow him anywhere, through any hazards. As long as he led the way, they would follow. So I used that for the book, but it cover the book actually, and it is one of Woad's most famous washes. That it's in a lot of Civil War books out there.
Right, it is republished a lot, but it's particularly useful here because it illustrates exactly what's happening at the Battle of Williamsburg, where Kearney's right in the middle of it.
You cut out there for a second.
Oh, yeah, I think it's particular. Oh, I was saying, I think it's particularly useful in your book because it illustrates exactly what it looks like right there at Williamsburg.
Well,
and the role that Kearney's playing.
I always prefer using accounts written by the soldiers themselves. Okay, and what I do to tell the narrative, I use my narrative in describing the action that day at Williamsburg. But let's hear from the men who made that charge and survived and wrote about it within hours or within days. And so I did those prior books called Writing and Fighting the Civil War, and they're made up of letters written from the battlefields. And they don't know the outcome of the war. They don't know who's going to win. They don't know if they're going to live another week. These are young men in a war situation. So I use their material, their letters, their accounts to illustrate what it was like there that day on May 5th, 1862. And their descriptions of seeing Kearney in action are better than me telling you or telling your audience. Let's hear from the soldiers themselves. And that's how I tried to utilize their words for the book.
Right, and this is something else that I think that our customers are going to want to know. There have previously been Kearney bios, and we've talked of some of the early ones, but this book is filled with so many primary sources that have never been used before. And so many perspectives that have never been used before on it. It's a story we think we know, but I think we find out we don't know it because
I'll say
new stuff.
For fear of offending someone out there, I'm sorry, I'll apologize ahead of, but of all the Civil War biographies ever written, and there's a lot of them, thousands, this one is truly unique. There's never been a biography of a Civil War figure like this. And that's what I set out to do. And this is 50 years of collecting those accounts and going in and finding those diary entries and that have never been published before. And with any book that I've ever done, I promise my readers what you're going to read you've never read before. This isn't just something that's been published over and over and over again. And so I really stressed to show a different side of him, his personal life and his letters, of course, and it's called The Life and Letters of Philip Kearny. So it's his writings, but it's also the men that served with him and under him. They loved him, and you can see that in their letters.
And time after time, he seems to be able to catch the imagination of people. Like there, when Alfred Woad, he could have drawn He could have drawn Hancock at that battle.
Yeah.
They were both there. He chose to draw Kearny.
Yeah, well, that at the time, Philip Kearny was probably the most famous soldier on that battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for what, his experience and his scandals and whatnot. But on that field at the time, Hancock wasn't very well known throughout the Army. On May 5th, 1862, went on to great things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Kearny died early in the war. Okay,
Yeah.
and so there were other heroes that followed, and they might have got more attention than he did. But the men who did the fighting always held Kearny in high regard.
Yeah, yeah. Then there's another really fun chapter that follows, of course, Williamsburg. But what happens at the Battle of Seven Pines, and we talked about the Thomas Kearny biography earlier, and you discussed Tom Kearny himself, and this particular copy includes references by Thomas Kearny and a presentation to a person named Guy Wellman about Wellman's father and Kearny's grandfather being together at the Battle of Seven Pines, and that would be a little side story that doesn't even really hit into the biography. But what does merit some discussion from Seven Pines is where Kearny decided he needed to know which stragglers were from his division and which ones were from different divisions. And I thought that was a fascinating story. I hadn't seen it again. Could you share that with us?
Yeah. Well, Kearny is credited with the inventing the division patch. Okay, when you see a soldier today, and on his sleeve is a patch denoting his division, what division he belongs to. It comes with Philip Kearny at the Battle of Seven Pines. He ordered some officers that were hiding behind the trees, and he cursed them and told them to get back to their commands, and they stood up and said, "I'm sorry, General, we're not of your command." And he said he apologized to them and said, "I'll take necessary means to identify my men in the future." So within a week or two, he ordered his men to start wearing a red patch upon their hats. Okay, and so this idea worked. That was known as the Kearny patch at the time. The following year, when General Joe Hooker had command of the Army of the Potomac, he instituted that idea throughout the Army, and it became the birth of the Corps badge. Mm-hmm. So it all began, when you see a soldier today and you see his division patch, it all started with Phil Kearny cursing some cowardly officers at the Battle of Seven Pines.
Right. I thought that was one of my favorite stories. But then again, the story of the battle and his leadership of the division at Seven Pines and throughout the 7 days is just as compelling. And again, you find tons of new stuff.
It inspired poetry. The famous poet Edmund Clarence Stedman wrote a poem, Kearny at Seven Pines, and it became very popular throughout the United States. And during an era where young schoolboys had to memorize and recite poetry in the classroom, they all would choose Kearny at Seven Pines or perhaps Sheridan's Ride. And young Teddy Roosevelt has memorized Kearny at Seven Pines. And I have a letter that he wrote in which he quotes from it. And it was an inspiration to a young Teddy.
Good. Hey, I got good news for you, Bill. You have been inspiring our customers to ask some questions. So I am going to put mine aside here, and let's see what we've got in the comments and questions section. And first out, I want a few more good shout outs here, Bill. David is watching from Red Hook in New York. Certainly some Red Hook people probably in Kearny's command. Diana Bowers Stewart Monroe says, great grandfather watching from Rumson, New Jersey. Granddaughter.
Okay. Yes, I know Diana. Yeah.
Okay. Evelyn Ponchak says, enjoying the bookshop interview. Looking forward to reading the book. Excellent. Thank you so much, Evelyn. And then we have questions. First, Fernando from Venezuela wants to know, what if, was he close to being the commander of the Army of the Potomac?
As a rule, I try not to do what ifs, but I'll make an exception.
Okay.
That was the story of the time. Okay. There are several eyewitness accounts, members of Kearney's staff, that claimed to have spoken with Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln, saying that if Kearney had arrived alive in Washington, instead of being killed at the Battle of Chantilly on September 1st, 1862, had Kearney arrived alive, he would have received command of the Army of the Potomac. These staff officers saw the paper on Stanton's desk. I have spent 30 plus years looking for that piece of paper, combing through the National Archives, trying to find, the actual documents that would prove that fact. I have not been successful, and many historians have tried. So whether it was signed by Lincoln, not signed by Lincoln, destroyed, we'll never really know. But there are several credible accounts saying that they saw the document.
Yeah.
Now, that aside, I believe he would have at least been given Corps command. And the Corps that I think he was slated for was the 12th Corps. Because at Kearney's funeral in New York City on September 6th, 1862, the military aspect of the funeral was commanded by General Mansfield, who, after the funeral, went to Washington, arrived on a Tuesday, and was given command of the 12th Corps, and was immediately mortally wounded at Antietam 5 days later. So we'll never know. Maybe out there somewhere is this document. If anybody out there watching today has any clue or can put me in the right direction, that would be great. But like I said, I've found a lot of documents in my day, in my decades of research, but that's the one that has eluded me.
Okay, it would be great if it came up. Don Harris wants to know, what backlash, if any, did Lincoln have due to taking Kearney into the Army?
Lincoln wouldn't permit anyone to speak badly about Kearney and his presence. Okay, so one of his, let's say, his circle did criticize him for doing that, and Lincoln shut him down and repeatedly said, "Kearney is my brigadier." And they said the account is he shed tears when he heard that Kearney was killed.
Yeah. Which does bring us. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, the very rare letter, it's in the Lincoln collection, the Library of Congress, is a letter written from Kearney's widow to the president saying, "Why didn't you stand by him?" And really, a unique letter. It's in the book, but I'm surprised. I don't think Lincoln ever responded to it. Perhaps he did, but we'll never know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that does bring us to the end of Kearney's life. And like every other chapter in his life, it's dramatic. There it is in the driving rainstorm at the Battle of Chantilly. And we don't have a ton of time left, Bill, because there's so much Kearney in memory in this book, too. And I want to touch on a little bit of that shortly. But if the students of Kearney or the Civil War know a little something about the Battle of Chantilly, the death of Stevens, the death of Kearney, the driving rainstorm, the New York Highlander Regiment, if they know all of that, is there anything, what do you have that's in this book that's a discovery about that last chapter of Kearney's life?
Well, I try to include both Union and Confederate accounts, and there definitely is a fog of war there. A lot of the modern historians today who write about Kearney or the Battle of Chantilly, they use the Confederate Veteran magazine, June 1907 issue. It was called "Who Killed Phil Kearney?" And there's a half dozen accounts in there. I checked each one of those writers. Not one of them was present when Kearney was killed. So, but I include some of them, but I have to point out that these men weren't there. This is all hearsay. And there's one or two accounts that were written by ones who actually witnessed it. And so I include those. and I put more stock into the wartime account than the stuff that's written decades later, 50 years later, 100 years later. You know, the wartime accounts are either the honest ones. So what I present are a few of the outlandish ones, and I point that out, and then I tell the reader this is most likely what happened.
Right.
And you know,
what's your evaluation? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What is your evaluation? Because what I like about what you've done here and what you're saying is that you want to use a lot of Confederate point of view accounts. What's your evaluation of the famous stories having to do with Confederate generals? General A.P. Hill, finding him in the mud, General Longstreet, General Lee dealing with his private,
Yes.
uniform and things.
When
Do those
Kearney
things hold up?
when Kearney was no, they don't.
Okay.
When Kearney was carried off the battlefield, no one knew who he was. He wasn't identified, and a captured Union prisoner was brought in to identify him. Then the body was carried to Lee's makeshift headquarters that evening, and a wake was held. Viewing the body was Stonewall Jackson, A.P. Hill, Longstreet, and Lee. And Lee was so visibly upset at seeing his close friend lying there in his headquarters. Lee took out his own pocket handkerchief and placed it over Kearney's face. But that was Kearney's first funeral. He had another one that followed up in New York City, sometime later, a week or so later. But his enemies gave him the best tribute of the next morning. Lee ordered the return of Kearney's body under a flag of truce, and wanted to send it back to the family. And then Lee took effort to find Kearney's personal possessions, his horse, saddle, and sword, and have them returned to the family. So it just wasn't another death. It was the death of their close friend. And it bothered Longstreet till the day he died. And actually, Stonewall Jackson and A.P. Hill died similar deaths, both out reconnoitering, and were killed, mortally wounded.
This is just points out to me anyway, and I know you've read so much Civil War, you might agree with it, is that every time you see a really too good to be true dramatic story of the death of a general or something like that, when you learn the real one, it turns out to be better.
Yeah, and that's how I present my whole work ethic is be honest. And I talk about the myth, but then I bring the reader back to reality and said, this is what I believe happened, or these are the accounts that I present that are written on the spot or within hours or days of the event, fresh in the memory.
For sure. Hey, Bill, we got one more chance for one more question from the audience. And thank you so much, folks, for giving us your questions. I love being able to know what you're thinking and know what you want to know from the book. So we have Steve Koppelman, and Steve's in Spotsylvania, Virginia. Steve wants to know, can you discuss the relationship between Kearney and Joe Hooker?
Friendly. Okay, they were both division commanders in Heintzelman's Third Corps. A bit competitive. Kearney, in his private correspondence, called Hooker an ass, and had no tactical brain. His idea was to go forward, fight the enemy, and not, didn't know ground and whatnot. So he didn't respect Hooker as a tactician, but realized he was a fighter, and that there were a few fighters in the Army in that time. Before we go, we have to show that special clip.
Oh, I definitely want to do that.
Okay.
But and we have 2 more minutes scheduled.
Okay.
But just like soccer, we started because we had problems with the live stream. We started 2 or 3 minutes late, Bill. So
okay.
So we're gonna have extra time built in here. But yeah, this is why I said I want to talk a little bit about the memory of Phil Kearny, because first of all, you talked about his first funeral. There was a second funeral, but now that he's dead, there's this persistent, heroic memory, loving memory of him, which leads to more and more public memory events of Phil Kearny, and eventually he ends up in Arlington. But he moves around before he gets there.
When his body was brought back to New Jersey for the wake at Belgrove, but then he was going to be placed in the family crypt in Trinity Churchyard in Manhattan, corner of Wall Street and Broadway. Kearny was buried there on September 6, 1862, but it was an unmarked grave, and it remained unmarked. And his veterans, his soldiers that served under him, wanted that grave marked. And the New Jersey Brigade, the veterans of the brigade in particular, wanted him taken from that unmarked grave and brought down to the National Cemetery at Arlington and have a equestrian statue placed there. But there was a lot of pushback from the family. They didn't want that to happen. But eventually they acquiesced. And in 1912, 50 years after Kearny's death, Kearny was removed from his grave at Trinity, and it was a national media event. Every newspaper in the United States wrote about it. Every New York City newspaper sent cameramen to photograph the event, and even the newsreels were there with their cameras whirling, and they filmed the event. I spoke to a descendant of General Kearny, a great-granddaughter, who died in 1993. She was a young girl in 1912. She remembered the event, and she went to the theater to watch the newsreel of Kearny's body removal. So I spent 30 years searching for that film.
Okay.
But no success until recently. We have a clip of Kearny's body being taken from City Hall in Manhattan, where it laid in state overnight, and carried out and placed on a caisson to be brought to the ferry, to the station, and then thence to Union Station in Washington.
Right.
So here is this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I want folks to get a chance. I'm going to leave it still here for a second, because I do want folks to get a second to know what they're about to see, Bill. And you said it's a Pathé. It's one of you found it in the Pathé archives
from 1912.
From 1912. Yeah. And so this was not only was it a national event, this was the footage you're going to get to see for the first time, folks, of that coffin being carried. Where is it being carried out of?
Out of City Hall in Manhattan. Okay. So, there are the steps of City Hall, which are where Lincoln's body laid in state and so on, and Kearny's body laid there for one evening. And April 12th, 1912, he's carried outside and placed on a caisson.
Okay, so Bill has sent us a clip about 17 seconds long, and we're just going to play it straight through, and you can see part of that funeral that everyone else saw at the movies. And so there it is. I wish I knew who those kids up there in the window were.
Yeah, the gentleman behind the casket I can recognize. They were part of
You recognize some of the men?
I recognize them. One is Charles Hopkins, who was president of the Kearny Veterans Brigade, and president of this commission. But he was also a Medal of Honor recipient and an Andersonville survivor. So Hopkins led that effort. I was good friends with Charles Hopkins' grandson, and he shared with me a lot of memories of that event. And, like I said, I've spoken to people in the 1980s that were there at these events and got their first hand impressions of it. And it was a national media event. The body of General Philip Kearny is going to be disinterred and brought to Arlington. And the whole country paid attention until 2-3 days later, the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank. And that pushed Kearny's body removal out of the news.
Yeah. So, I love that context. That here we have this Civil War story that goes from the battlefield at Chantilly, a Civil War, or the battle. Think of the Battle of Williamsburg, where Kearney's a watercolor wash by Alfred Woad, and eventually we get to see him in film, or at least his casket in film, within the context of the Titanic disaster.
Interesting little story that Thomas Kearny tells it too, though. But when they were going to bring Kearny's body to Arlington, the Army administrators required a identification of the remains. Mm-hmm. And inside the crypt, there were a dozen coffins. They weren't sure which was his coffin, but they took a chance and they opened one, and they were expected to find ashes and sift through the bones to possibly find his remains. But he was preserved perfectly. The embalmers did good work, and they said his hair was perfect, his beard was perfect, skin was a bit shrunken, but his uniform and the gold button still shined, and they looked like he was going to step forth and ask why they were disturbing him at this time. But he was perfectly preserved 50 years later, and it's likely that he's still pretty good at Arlington.
Down there in Arlington. And there's a statue at Arlington, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It was the only equestrian statue until there was another one that was put up to a British officer that was serving during World War II in Washington, and he has an equestrian. But it's a beautiful statue. It's directly behind the Lee Mansion at Arlington, and if you ever visit, go pay your respects to Phil Kearny.
All right. Well, after 50 years, congratulations, Bill. After 50 years, you've landed this project. Therefore, my next question is, what's next after this one?
The book is 1 million words, 1,000 footnotes, 6.5 pounds of biography. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know if there's going to be another book. I don't know if I have 50 years of research left in me.
Right.
And I try to research pretty thorough, but who knows? Maybe we'll discover some letters or diaries in the future. That's one thing I promise my readers in any of my books. What you're going to read, you've never seen it before, because that's what interests me. If it's new and it's unpublished and it catches my attention, then I love doing it. But I get tired of the same old quotes that are repeated over and over again.
Right. So for the folks at home, the book we are talking about again is General Philip Kearny, A Very God of War, The Life and Letters of General Philip Kearny, published by Belgrove Publishing Company, which is your publishing company, Bill. This is a first edition copy that you can get. It will be signed directly by the author, and the order is actually being fulfilled by Bill in New Jersey.
I'll be signing books all weekend, I hope.
Excellent. There are 813 pages. It's illustrated. There are maps, and we are charging $67 for it. Your shipping is included in that. That's it. So
it's a very heavy
67
book.
plus more. You'll get it all just for that one price.
It's a very heavy book. That's the thing. Yeah. It's 6.5 pounds of book. So if you see the other Kearny biographies, they're a little smaller, but they're all right. They're good. Yeah. But I wanted to include everything I found, but there are a few things I couldn't fit in. Save that for the next edition, maybe.
And it's hard to put video in a biography, but sure enough, you found some. Hey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm just going to tell the folks